everyone, today we will be explaining about radiocarbon dating, a powerful method scientists use to determine age of ancient materials. This technique helps us to learn about the past in fields like archaeology and geology.
For introduction for radiocarbon dating, radiocarbon dating uses the decay of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope, to find how old an organic material are. Discovered by Willard Libby in 1947, it is utilized in archaeology, geology, history, and forensics. We can learn more about human history and the past by using this method to date key discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls and Otzi the Iceman. What is carbon-14? Carbon-14 forms when a cosmic ray hits nitrogen in the atmosphere. Plants absorb carbon-14 through carbon dioxide. Animals get carbon-14 by eating plants after death. Organisms stop absorbing carbon-14, which begins to decay. Carbon-14 have 6 protons and 8 neutrons. Carbon-14 half-life is 5,730 plus minus 40 years after an organism has died.
The first equation essentially quantifies how quickly a reaction proceeds, which R is a measurement of the rate of decay, K is the first order rate constant for the isotope, and N is the amount of radioisotope at the moment when the rate is measured. And on the second equation, the left side is natural logarithm of the ratio of the amount remaining, which is N to the initial amount, which is N0. This ratio represents the fraction of the original radioisotope that has not decayed. And on the right side, the negative of the rate constant, which determines how quickly it decays, times with the time elapsed since the initial measurement. This equation helps to predict the amount of a radioisotope remaining at a given time.
Radiocarbon dating depends on a nuclear process called radioactive decay. Specifically, carbon-14 atoms inside a sample will undergo beta decay, where a neutron changes into a proton and releases a beta particle, an antineutrino. This transforms carbon-14 into nitrogen-14. Unlike chemical reactions that involve electrons and bonds, this decay happens inside the atom's nucleus. Carbon-14 decay at a steady, predictable rate, with a half-life of about 5,730 years. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains in a sample, scientists can calculate how long it has been since the organism died.
Let's compare collision theory and radiocarbon decay to understand why there are different processes. Collision theory explains how chemical reactions happen. For a reaction to occur, particles must collide with enough energy, called an activation energy, and in the correct orientation to break or form bonds. Things like temperature, pressure, and catalysts affect how often and how effectively these collisions can happen, so they can speed up or slow down the reaction. On the other hand, radiocarbon decay is a nuclear process that happens inside the atom's nucleus. It doesn't involve any collisions or breaking chemical bonds. Instead, a neutron in a carbon-14 nucleus changes into a proton and emits a beta particle in a process called beta decay. This decay happens spontaneously at a constant rate no matter the temperature, pressure, or the presence of catalysts. In short, chemical reactions rely on particles' collision and conditions, but radiocarbon decay is a steady nuclear event unaffected by any external factors. Here's how radiocarbon dating works. While an organism is alive, it takes in carbon from the air or food, including a tiny bit of radioactive carbon called carbon-14. When the organism dies, it stops taking in carbon-14. From that point, the carbon-14 in its body starts to slowly disappear. This happens because carbon-14 breaks down into another element called nitrogen-14. This process is steady and happens at a known rate. Scientists measure how much carbon-14 is left in the sample. Then they use a formula to figure out how much carbon-14 was there when the organism was alive and how much is left now. Using this, they calculate how long ago the organism died. One important thing to know is that the amount of carbon-14 in the air has changed a little over thousands of years. To make sure the dates are accurate, scientists compare the radiocarbon dates with other methods, like counting tree rings, which shows the exact years. This helps adjust their results using something called a calibration curve, which shows the dates that match the real calendar years. A cool fact is that new technology can measure carbon-14 even in a very tiny samples, smaller than a grain of rice. So radiocarbon dating helps us to know how old things are by measuring how much carbon-14 is left, using math to calculate the time and correcting for changes in the atmosphere. Radiocarbon dating is a very important tool for studying the past in many fields. In archaeology, it helps us to find out the age of things like human bones, tools, pottery, and cave paintings. For example, it was used to date the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are about 2,000 years old, and the Old Sea the Icemen, who lived over 5,000 years ago. In geology and earth science, radiocarbon dating helps us understand the age of sediment layers, peat bogs, and glacial deposits. This tells us about ancient landscapes and events like erosions. Climate scientists used it to study the old ice cores and wood to see how carbon dioxide levels and climates have changed over thousands of years. In history, it helps us to verify whether artifacts and manuscripts are genuine and can also estimate the time of death in forensic cases.
Radiocarbon is very useful because it can accurately date samples that are up to 50,000 years old, covering a large part of human history. It is also non-destructive, so valuable samples aren't damaged during the testing. Modern methods like accelerator mass spectrometer allow scientists to work with very small sample sizes, making the process more efficient. Radiocarbon dating is also widely accepted and used across many scientific fields, helping researchers learn about the past in archaeology, geology, history, and forensics.
The first one is age limit. Samples that are older than about 40,000 years old are extremely difficult to date due to tiny levels of carbon-14, and over 60,000 years old cannot be dated at all. The second one is contamination. Contamination in radiocarbon dating refers to the introduction of carbon-containing materials that are not originally part of the sample being dated. Radiocarbon dating samples can indeed be contaminated by other carbon-containing materials. This contamination can significantly affect the accuracy of dating results, leading to inaccurate age estimations. And the third one is calibration issues. The shape of the radiocarbon calibration curve, especially the flat or wavy sections, can cause smearing of calibrated dates. It means that dates become spread out or blurred over a range of calendar years, making it hard to determine an exact calendar age for the sample.
Let's summarize. Radiocarbon dating uses the decay of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope, to figure out how old organic materials are. Carbon-14 forms when cosmic ray hits nitrogen in the atmosphere, and plants absorb carbon-14 through carbon dioxide. Animals get carbon-14 by eating plants, and after death, organisms stops absorbing carbon-14, which begins to decay. Let's go into the different laws. So the rate law, radioactive decay follows a first-order rate law and first-order kinetic law, meaning that the rate of decay is directly proportional to the number of radioactive nuclei present. Let's go into theory. The collision theory is about chemical reaction needing collision and condition. However, radiocarbon decay happens naturally inside atoms and doesn't depend on anything outside. Real-world application. Use of archaeology, ecology, and earth science, climate change and history, and forensic. Benefits. Accurate for dating samples, require little samples, reliable dates, non-destructive, and widely accepted. Challenges and limitation. Limited to only 50,000 years and can be contaminated, and there's also calibration issues. So in this slide, I will be talking about the research summary about geomorphology. So geomorphology is the study of Earth's formation, evolution, and examination of the natural and human-induced forces. Geomorphology is a very important aspect of radiocarbon dating, which means that radiocarbon dating has been widely used as a chronological tool, similarly to geomorphology. Let's go into examples of how this is used. So a researcher determines the age of the living eucalyptus tree growing in around the Alluvia Gurries, using the carbon-14 dating to define the timing and estimate rate of the gully erosion. This study shows the diversity of application of the radiocarbon method in geomorphological investigation. Let's go deeper down into detail of the formation of carbon dating. So, carbon-14 is a type of radioactive isotope which is formed in the upper atmosphere by particles from outer space interacting with nitrogen. Later, it gets transformed into carbon dioxide and get absorbed by those plants, which means that when the organism eat those plants and they die, the carbon-14 will stop the absorption process and the isotope begins to decay. Using the accelerator mass spectrometer or AMS to measure the ratio of carbon-14 in the sample of the organic materials. So when cosmic ray hits the Earth's atmosphere, the neutrons collide with the nitrogen-14, giving a product of carbon-14 and protons, which is shown in the first step of the picture. And after the organism died, the product, which is carbon-14, starts to decay back into nitrogen-14, which is shown in the picture in step 2.